So I'm a software engineer at LogMeIn. Prior to that, I was at IBM down in Austin, Texas. I co-host a podcast with a couple of my friends that you can go check out. We talk all things tech and career. And I also created an open source project called Coding Coach that helps connect mentors with mentees in the tech industry for free. So if you're looking for a mentor, go check it out. In February of 2018, I moved from Austin, Texas to Karlsruhe, Germany. And I was born and for 24 years raised in the US. I had traveled to Europe and a few other countries, but not for extensive amounts of time. So you can imagine that selling everything and moving to a foreign country came with a bit of culture shock, especially because I didn't speak any German. And when I arrived in Germany, I quickly began to notice how different everything was. So the street signs were different, the public transportation was different, especially because America doesn't know what public transportation is. And yeah, these systems were so wildly different from what I was used to, and I became pretty uncomfortable. For 24 years, I'd lived in a society where I understood the systems behind daily life. I understood that when they opened a new checkout line at the supermarket, you would generally turn around and tell the people hey, you were here, or the people in front of you would say hey, you were here longer, do you want to go ahead of me? But when they did that in Germany and I tried to do that, the people behind me were already running to get ahead of me. And I really didn't get it. Why was the system so different in Germany? Well, I quickly realized that every country has its own systems for daily life. Even the ways in which we build our homes are rooted in systems. America, for example, uses round doorknobs, which is not a thing in Europe. They don't use round doorknobs at all, or sometimes they don't even use doorknobs. It's it doesn't turn, which is kind of weird. And we have windows that open vertically, right? You don't see that in Europe. They kind of tilt inward or they tilt back. I thought I broke the window the first time I tried to open it. So every area in the world has its own paradigm for systems. They're in the world all around us, and our products are no exception. The internet was not originally built for large-scale social and enterprise applications. It was really built to share data all over the world. And a lot of the terminology that we've coined in regards to the internet has its roots in printed books. When we think of web pages, even just the word has its root back to printed books, where you physically had to turn a page to get to the next piece of content or to continue reading. This concept of saving a website for later reference, called bookmarking, well, where does this come from? Printed books. And as a last example, pagination. So this concept of navigating through tables or different pages of your websites takes place in printed books. But this poses a problem because we don't develop websites as full pages anymore. Web pages do not equate to reusability. And when we equate these things subconsciously, we kind of throw reusability out the window. And when we don't reuse our code or our designs, consistency and accessibility, even development speed, can suffer. So instead of thinking in terms of pages, we should kind of shift our mindset and view them, all these components, modularly, right, that can be reused. And modern JavaScript frameworks and libraries, such as Vue, Angular, React, etc., have really made this concept of components more mainstream. And web components are even built into the Web Standards API. So this component-based paradigm has already begun with our code bases. So why haven't all companies kind of adopted this modular approach to brand identity and design workflows? The way in which we design and develop products is shifting to components. But this poses a problem because we all think about the world in different ways. And this leads us to building inconsistent UIs. If I ask you to picture a chair, perhaps you'll think of one like this. Or maybe it'll look more like this. Or maybe you like orange, and it'll look like this. So if we all have these different images of chairs in our mind, imagine what happens if I ask you to think of what a button would look like. And this is where design systems really shine. They allow us to create cohesive experiences throughout all legs of the user's journey. But what exactly is a design system? Well, unfortunately, there's no industry definition for a design system, and that can make it a bit tricky to understand. So if you hear a designer say design system, they're probably referring to the design language and the UI kit. Well, when we hear a developer say design system, they're probably talking about component libraries or the style guides. But a design system encompasses all of these things: the UI kit, component library, style guide, and design language. And so we need to start thinking of it not just from a design or an engineering perspective, but from all of it. Brand identity. This is one of the benefits. Design systems allow companies to define their brand identity and bake it into their accessible, consistent, and reusable components. And some of the benefits that come along with that: one, accessibility. I don't think I need to convince you that accessibility is important. Everyone, regardless of circumstance, should be able to achieve the same result from your application. So design systems ensure your applications have accessible color palettes, they have a contrast ratio, the type scales are legible. It also ensures that all of the components within your web app can be used with just a keyboard and that they're screen reader friendly. Consistency is another big one. Design systems facilitate consistency. And we live in an era where it's really common for one company to own many different products with similar brand identities. If we take Google, for example, they have a suite of products, and they all look and feel like they come from the same family. So I can use Google Drive, Maps, Flights, and I'll see the same web components and styles each time. So when your company owns a suite of products similar to Google, consistency is key. Trickle-down style updates is another huge benefit. When a design pattern is updated, the engineers no longer have to sync cross-squad to implement this change. They can just edit the one component in the design system and have it propagate with just an update to the package. Responsiveness. So design systems are built to be responsive. And mobile devices account for about half of all web traffic worldwide. So our applications really have to account for different screen resolutions and devices. And design systems ensure that they do. So onboarding is twofold. Having a well-documented design system ensures that when you receive new hires, they have to go to one place to learn how to build your products. And this is a lot less overhead than sending them, a list of different links that they have to go to onboard themselves. But additionally, if you have multiple squads working on different teams or products or code bases, they're sharing the same system. And so you can take developer from squad A and put them on squad B, and there's no time to get up to speed on how to actually develop. Now, you're probably confused by this because I just said consistency is really important. But design systems have to be flexible because our products have to serve different needs and different use cases. But we have to establish boundaries within which we can be flexible and within which the teams can customize. So, for example, mobile, you might need one long button at the bottom that spans the viewport width. In web, you wouldn't see a button that spans the whole viewport width. That would look insane. So you have to be able to account within boundaries for these small, medium, and large buttons, for example. And lastly, improve design and development speed. So once you've had a stable release and your system's in a decently stable place, the designers and developers can use the UI kit and the component library to rapidly develop things, and you can get product releases done a lot quicker. But it would be a little bit naive of me to just stand up here and tell you all the benefits, because there are obviously some drawbacks. Rome was not built in a day. Your design system will not be built in a day. They take time to build. And I'm not talking a couple of weeks. I'm talking months to several years. It kind of depends on your team structure. So there's definitely some time it takes. And they're products. Design systems are not projects with a finite end date. They're products, and they serve other products. And so they're ever evolving. You don't build a product and ship it, and you're never going to touch it again. You kind of have to keep updating it, right? So when you build it from the ground up, you just have to be aware that it's not going to be a finite end date. And likewise, you're going to have to maintain it. It's a living, breathing product. It has life cycles. It's going to require maintenance. And we can't develop it without a team, so you're going to have an investment of designers, developers, product managers, things like that. And I know stakeholders love hearing that they need bodies to work on products, right? That's their favorite thing to hear. So it can be kind of hard to convince them sometimes. And so we have to kind of put this in terms of the monetary perspective, how is building a design system going to impact the monetary reward? What's the outcome? So given all these downsides, the number one reasons that design systems fail is a lack of team buy-in. The product teams are your primary stakeholder, and if you don't have buy-in from it, it's going to be pretty impossible to succeed. But design systems are not necessarily built in a silo. There are 3 different team structures with which you can build a design system. Well, 3 that I'm going to discuss today. The first is this idea of a centralized model. So the design system is governed by a centralized core team who are autonomous in running and maintaining the system. So they're going to define the foundation and the identity of the system. They're going to have veto power. So if someone comes in and says, I want a brown button that flashes, different gradients every 5 seconds, they can say, no, like that's a horrible idea. We're not going to do that. And they're responsible for managing and creating the UI kit, the component library, and the style guide. So this is what it could generally look like. You're going to have cross-functional areas. So you're going to have design, engineering, and product working together to build this system, and it'll propagate out to the teams. Airbnb is just one example of a company who leverages this centralized model. So it is definitely being used to build these huge design systems. But maybe you can't devote a core team. Maybe then you need more of a distributed model. And that's when the system is built and maintained by those using it. So in the distributed model, this kind of allows individuals to make decisions, and it instills them with a sense of ownership. And people are much more passionate when they have, a hand in actually building something. And the decisions aren't concentrated. They're going to be influenced by many different vantage points. This could be really great. So you're not encapsulated in this little bubble. Instead, you've got all of these different, different viewpoints that you can use to build your system. And if someone on the team's unavailable, the progress doesn't stop, which is really great. That could be a problem with centralized teams. If your lead designer is out for 2 months, what are you going to do? And so in this model, the design system's at the center, and the product teams are both consuming and contributing to it. TED is just one example of a company that uses a distributed team approach to building their system. But maybe you kind of want to combine the two. Maybe you want to have a centralized core team that also works, kind of open source internally with your product teams. And so we've got, this core team in the center, the multifaceted design, engineering, and product, who are really responsible for governing the direction of the product. But you also get input from the product teams to help build it. And this seems to be kind of like the most efficient way to do it if you have the ability to build one this way. Spotify is one example of a company building a hybrid approach to their design system. And many other really big companies are adopting and building their own systems. MailChimp, IBM, Shopify, Google, Atlassian, and Etsy are just a few. And even NASA, of all things, that's super cool. NASA has a design system. So do a lot of political campaigns as well. So one important note is that design systems are not necessarily built for public consumption. Generally, they're being built for the companies themselves. They're not necessarily meant for you to consume. Chris Coyer wrote an article on CSS Tricks, and he said, if a design system is by a company, then it's for the company. It might be open source, but any old random developer who wants to use it is not the target audience. So I could go, clone IBM Carbon's design system and make my portfolio look like an IBM product, but why would I do that? They don't open source it for public consumption necessarily. They open source it to share their knowledge and their architecture and their learnings with the community. But if my talk thus far has really not convinced you, and you're like, I don't get it. I don't understand. Why are we building design systems? Let's talk money. Nathan Curtis is a very prominent speaker within design systems, and he wrote a wonderful series of blog posts on Medium. It's called And You Thought Buttons Were Easy. So I'd like to share some of his insights with you today. I think it's really going to drive the point home. We're all familiar with buttons. They're not exactly the hardest component to build. But we can sometimes kind of forget how complex buttons really are, how comprehensive it really is. So we have to worry about things like padding, margin, border radius, background color, font size, font family. And since buttons are one of the most frequently used elements throughout a UI or an application, they can really impact your brand identity. But we're not done, because now we have to worry about hover, focus, active, disabled. We can't just design it in its neutral state. It's a living component. We're still not done, because you don't just have primary buttons. You've also got secondary and tertiary buttons to account for. Oh, but you might want icons, because everyone puts icons all over the place. So we have to have all 3 of those, but with icons. And also maybe without text. Maybe we need a primary button with just an icon. dark theme. I don't need to go into that debate. But then also we've got sizes, right? So when you put all this together, you're like, oh my God, that's a lot of stuff for a button. We forgot about this. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into designing a button. We don't think about these things. But once you design it, you're not done. We actually have to put in our products, and we have to build them to be accessible. So they have to be keyboard navigable and work with screen readers. They have to be responsive, so if I resize my window, it's not going to break the whole UI. We have to ensure that all the design specs are actually met. It has to be flexible so that if I don't pass in a property, it's not going to destroy the whole UI. We need to make sure that, let's be honest, sometimes we're lazy as engineers, right? We don't want to add 15 props to a button to make it work. So we need to ensure that when we're building it, that it's flexible and our engineers are not going to get mad at us for requiring 15 props. We have to test things to make sure it's not going to break anything else and that it's working as expected. And of course, we have to document it, because if you don't write down how to use it, no one's going to use it. And when we think about a designer, engineer, and QE working together to design, build, and test these buttons, and let's assume that people, for the sake of this, and even numbers, let's say 100 an hour. And let's assume total, it takes 200 total hours of work, because we always underestimate, and then we always go over. And also these discussions take time, right? We can't just design and build in a silo. It's going to take time. And it's about 66.6 hours of work per person. You're spending $20,000 on buttons. And that's just one team creating this library. Well, if you have an enterprise company with 50 teams, each building, designing, and testing buttons, that's $1 million you're spending on buttons. And you can also bet that the quality is going to vary with each different version that the team is producing. Yeah, you need a design system. So let's break down the 3 pillars. So design language. This is the set of standards and assets that guide the creation of a suite of products underneath a brand. And I like to think of this kind of as the personality of a brand and its corresponding design assets. So it's comprised of 2 main areas. So we've got the foundation, and we've got the UI kit. Well, the foundation covers things like accessibility guidelines, brand identity, color, typography, grid, spacing, motion, icons, content. It goes on and on. But these are essentially guidelines for how we develop our products. And then we've got the component library, which is probably why we're all here. I'm not going to be telling you how to build a component library, but there is a talk coming up that talks about components. Highly recommend that you go watch. I'm excited for that one. And obviously, these are coded components, but they turn your design language and your UI kit into living, breathing code. And you'll notice in these larger companies, the component libraries might have many different JavaScript frameworks or libraries, and generally they'll also just use plain JavaScript. But you need to also kind of meet the teams where they're at. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the way that we build ours is to separate the CSS from the JavaScript and then use them together. And why do we do this? Well, some teams are not going to just want to import and use a React component right away. Maybe there's a reason why they can't. Maybe they have a legacy code base that they're trying to upgrade. So by separating the CSS out and making them importable by component, if I just want to style my buttons, I can just import that one CSS file and I'm good to go. And then we install that as a dependency into our React components, and that way things are a little bit more modular. And we have our style guide. So this is a documentation for your design language, your UI kit, your component library. It's essentially the home for all of the documentation of your system. So Google Material Design, this is one example of a style guide. They all generally kind of follow the same layout. Material Design is special because that counts for iOS, Android, web. They've got a lot of different endpoints that they're working with. Atlassian's another one. And this sounds great. But I still haven't actually told you how to build it yet. So let's do that. So the first step is going to be establish your design principles. So these are your grounding values and principles that drive the creation of your products. We just saw Atlassian. Atlassian's design principles are bold, optimistic, and practical. And they should really drive all of the decisions that your teams are making. So start with your purpose. These have to support the global vision of your product and express its identity. What do you want your users to feel when using your product? And once we've defined that, we can go and do a UI audit, because many of us are not building products from the ground up. Many of us are working on legacy code bases. And so the first step is to take screenshots of all of your components in every single state and then visually group them by functionality. So you can do that in Sketch. You can put it in presentation if you want, just physically group them. We're not grouping by visual appearance here, though. We're grouping by functionality because the visual design patterns are going to evolve over time, but the underlying functionality and behavior is going to remain. So make sure that you're grouping by functionality. And then once we have done our UI audit, we kind of need to prioritize what to work on first. So which components are going to have the highest impact on the unification of your products? And how feasible is this component to build? So like a button is probably a little bit easier to physically build than maybe an accordion or something a little bit more interactive. So prioritize the highest impact and highest feasibility elements first. And then we can actually start designing and building. So we have to design our components and take our brand identity and start iterating. What do we want this to manifest as? And we build it. And I said this before, we have to meet the teams where they are today. If I'm trying to sell something to you that you don't need, you're not going to want it. So we have to meet them. If our teams are building in Dojo, I'm not going to go give them an Ember component. Like, they're not going to use it. So you have to go meet them where they're at and be intentional when choosing a tech stack. Don't choose things that are cool and hip to use. Choose things that are practical and that will maintain over a long time. We have to test them. And we have to document them. And then we get to release. We also have to decide how to version our components. Do we want to version by component, by module, or version the system as a whole? I don't think there are any guidelines on how to do this yet. I'm not too sure, personally, since design systems is so new. But I personally lean towards like release it or versioning the modules specifically, because if you update the version of your system every single change, like if I change the background color of a button, it's just going to become a lot. This is kind of what the process looks like. So we design, build, test, document, and release. We're going to do that for every component. It's going to be cyclical. And at some point, you're going to start receiving new component requests. And we kind of have to determine whether or not they should be incorporated into our system. So we first have to determine the degree of like the detractors for this request. And we can do that by asking some questions. And product design and engineering should answer these questions together, because if we just have designers answering these questions, the result might not be the best for engineering. Maybe it's not technically feasible to do this change. So we need to examine the impact of incorporating this change from many different vantage points. So some questions you might ask are, does this request embody our design principles? If it doesn't, well, we're not going to incorporate it. Is this going to require a lot of design and development effort to build? Does this come with a high risk of success for our product? Does this coincide with our product roadmap? And is this going to require a lot of maintenance? Well, then let's flip sides and let's take a look at some of the promoters. Will this improve the user experience of our products? Do we have a high level of confidence with this decision, or are we going to have to revisit this again in like a month? And also, is it technically feasible? Because if we can't build it, well, it's not going to go anywhere, right? And so once we've answered these questions from product design and engineering, we can kind of, at a glance, determine whether or not this should be immediately adopted or immediately rejected, or maybe we need to have more discussion and kind of refine some details. So proposals with a high impact that really uphold your brand identity, that you're very confident are going to be around for a long time, but that also aren't going to require a lot of maintenance. They're not going to have a lot of risk associated with them, and they're not going to require a ton of effort. These are the ones you can say with confidence, yeah, absolutely, like let's go adopt them. And those things with high maintenance, high risk, high effort, but aren't going to really impact our products very well, those are the things, we don't really want to incorporate. And while all of this sounds really great and kind of easy, I want to share some advice to avoid some common pitfalls. I think as engineers, we want to think about scaling as one of the first things we do when we build anything. And this can kind of backfire a little bit. If you start building for every single endpoint and every single product from day one, you're going to become overwhelmed, and you're going to incorporate things into your system that maybe haven't been thought through. So start small, and when you need to scale, you can scale. But if I'm not using accordions in my products, I'm not going to go build one. It's just wasted development and design effort. So don't start for scale, scale once you need to. And this is a mistake I've made. Don't educate before you build, because if you tell people how great your design system is and you don't have a design system, they're going to get pretty annoyed with you. So build something and spread the word. Don't spread the word before you've built something. This is one I recommend as well, a working contract or a social contract within your team. You're going to have people with many different viewpoints, and you want to know how to collaborate effectively together. And so you maybe want to establish like a contract that says how you want to collaborate, especially if you're working on distributed teams all over the world. Figure out how you want to make decisions. So once you make a decision, you also want to record it, because the thing about engineering teams, they like to question decisions. And so we want to record these things so that when they have questions, we don't spend a multitude of time like explaining our justification and our process for things. So make sure that you record these things. You might not need a design system. So design systems are wonderful for large companies with many different products that want to unify them under a brand identity. But if you're building a small application for your mom's restaurant, you don't need a design system. So they're great for large companies, but you don't necessarily need one. And it's really important to kind of examine the opportunity cost of doing that prior to just going ahead and building one. Maybe you just need a style guide. Maybe you just need to kind of wrap all of these colors and font choices up into a nice little style guide, and you don't need a full component library. So just make sure you examine that before you just jump right in and build one. If you have further questions, I'm going to be doing a front-end master's workshop on design systems where we'll physically go and we'll build some design language. We'll actually learn about topography and color theory and all that fun stuff. We'll build the components, and we'll document them with storybooks. So if you're interested, you can attend online. And with that, thank you.